I want to explore the boomer and millennial, say, war or clash, and the way how this is demonstrative of a simulation. And so therefore this narrative that it's offered is like one of great, say, resentment, a clash of values and economic fortunes. You know, millennials are told that they've been locked out of prosperity, that their parents maybe perhaps took for granted. The boomers in turn see a generation of entitled brats, avocado toast eating children who refuse to grow up. And so this is presented as a drama, but is this just like a pantomime? But we can look at this from Rene Girard's mimic theory, or his theory of desire, but that this is not a war, it's theatre or it's a simulation, because there's nothing at play within this dynamic. So this model rival dynamic is underwritten by a foundational premise that essentially both accept and they refuse to question, and as a result of that, there's nothing at play, there's nothing at stake with it. For people that aren't familiar with Rene Girard's theory of desire, it's essentially that we desire what other people designate as desirable. So ultimately, we really don't, our desires are not our own. And so we don't necessarily want things or whatever they could be, but they're only given value as a result of the designation from the model that we emulate. This creates the triangle of the subject, the object, and the model. And so this is the way that we can read what's occurring between millennials and the boomers. So we can look at what the boomers designate as valuable. Any generation that comes before designates to the ones that follow what is considered to be desirable. This is just the natural progression of life. And so what a successful life looks like for millennials in this case is obviously designated by boomers. So what would that be? Well, you could say it's the suburban idyll. It's essentially just a subdivided Eden. So post-war, you have the boom in the market economy, in the mass market, we could say. And so as a result of that, all that development gives rise to the suburban idyll. And so therefore that's what is designated as desirable. And we can say that the conflict arises because ultimately that cannot be attained by millennials. So they come after, and so, you know, there's a multitude of reasons why, we could say. So there's economic shifts, debasement of currency, the nature of, say, economic policy in reference to globalization. There's all these factors that come into it. And so that suburban idyll becomes ever more distant or more ephemeral. And so that the boomer that once designated, obviously that model becomes the rival to it. And so we could say that this is the source of the resentment of millennials. Is that so they desire ultimately what boomers have, because boomers have been the ones that have designated what is desirable. Now, this makes perfect sense. Everybody would probably agree from a generational perspective the nature of what the generation that precedes endows, you know, hands down. And so that is a way that we could kind of look at the precursors to what would be the issue. So what we need to explore here is that, well, what do both of them don't question? Both of them share a stage or a context that both ultimately don't question. So we could say that this is designed in a way to discount questioning life beyond what is designated as desirable. And so in turn both generations share like a commonality, and so there is no difference ultimately between them. So we have to look at what they accept. What is it that's being designated? If the suburban idyll is the end of a buyer's journey, then ultimately that's all millennials are sold on. Because, once again, if boomers have designated what is desirable as a buyer's journey, and they resent the fact that they cannot attain what has been what has been designated as desirable as that suburban ideal, then ultimately they both accept the production process of themselves as a credit instrument. And so if you're looking at the way how you're credited as a consumer, and you don't ultimately understand how that occurs, the whole dynamic, this binary, is designed obviously to externalize thinking about what is this fight over nothing ultimately, or it's a fight that presupposes something is at stake, the future, but that future is literally just a buyer's journey. So you could say that what both generations are doing are binding themselves together in a buyer's journey set for life. They don't question the nature of that totalising claim because they're sold on what is designated as desirable. And so their rivalry is not between two worlds. If you're looking at, say, the what's at stake with the clash, as it were, well, there's nothing at stake. There's no dispute because both of them accept that the buyer's journey is commensurate with life. And so you're just looking at the way how they're vying over ascendancy in reference to that. So what happens through that dynamic is that both of them don't question their existential status. There's obviously the accusation is invaded against both. The millennial blames the boomer for pulling up the ladder. The boomer blames the millennial for being lazy. And so therefore they both fail to see, or they both fail to look at life holistically, we could say. And so therefore view the world from a more holistic perspective. So there's ultimately nothing at stake when you're looking at this thing. So you could say that the fight is just the agency that you're credited when you're given as a demand centre. That's literally it. Because what kind of buys offered? If what is set for life is a totalising claim of a buyer's journey, well then ultimately that is what is transcendent. And so the resentment comes from the fact that buyer's journey is not as lucrative as the one that the boomers ultimately travelled. That's literally it. So there's nothing in play there, as it were, because there's no possibility for transformation of the self if the way how that you're orientated towards the suburban ideal is to a return on the absencing of creativity when you're given as a demand centre. So what both of them do is just invest in the system that outsources thinking or discounts the spiritual question of people's actions. You could say that this whole great conflict, is like literally a pantomime, and it's designed maybe to entertain each other, like something's at stake. If millennials think that boomers are like Saturn and it's eating the future or eating the young, then ultimately they would think that they're fighting for the future. They're staking a future. They're staking a claim in the future, but that future claim is literally just a buyer's journey that's been set for their aspirations. What are you meant to do when, say a older generation is meant to be bequeathing wisdom to the younger ones? Well, you're meant to obviously get ahead. Now, how can you get ahead of a totalising claim of a buyer's journey? Think of that. That's the double bind. So that double bind, as far as boomers and millennials, is not ultimately questioned, because the nature of what they're vying over is the agency that you're credited when you're given as a demand centre. So the double bind is not even acknowledged for an impasse, a civilizational impasse. So if the only way that you can look at that, the simulation, the stake in nothing, is literally by looking at the way how that if a older generation is meant to impart something, is designating, say, what is desirable, and yet that desire is unattainable through circumstance, then ultimately the double bind is based upon the nature of credit that is being externalized or outsourced. And so once again, they refused to look at their existential status because both are sold on the totalizing claim of a buyer's journey. So that would mean to say that what needs to be designated as desirable would not be based upon a buyer's journey. If you look at it like from a spiritual perspective, which is ultimately what we're doing, then you can understand that you take that binary of millennial and boomer, that both of them are sold on a buyer's journey, and so anything that's going to be designated as desirable obviously can't fall prey to the double bind of getting ahead of a totalizing claim of a buyer's journey. All right, it's because that, if you think of that, that relates to the nature of what you're credited when you're given as a demand center. And so that means to say that you're looking at your existential status or in reference to what animates your actions. If what animates your actions as money making is social mobility, so what that means as far as, say, millennials and the way how they resent boomers, well, obviously that's in reference to a transcendence that's still much based upon a suspended animation. Because how can you be orientated towards, say, temporalizing the indivisibility of your being if you're always given it as a credit instrument? So once again, you take what you're told. You're told to get ahead. All right. Just think of what that means when there's a totalizing claim that's made on time and you have to acquit yourself of it. There is no way that you can get ahead of what has been designated for life, because all you're going to be doing is your life is going to be policed through sentinels. And so you can look at this scenario of this pantomime, this bloody simulation is nothing else but giving you context that this is the whole thing needs to be left behind. And so what is designated is an initiation that has nothing to do to the way how that you acquit yourself of a transcendentalism or bad faith of a religiosity, which ultimately, both boomers and millennials are guilty of. They have faith in that way of life, and so are almost vying over the remnants, or what remains of it, what remains of the dream, the American dream, we could say. And as I've stated prior, to go from a buyer's journey is to be orientated towards a walkabout, and that's where you dream time beyond the totalizing claim of a buyer's journey. And that's literally a rite of initiation.